The quietest person in the room is sometimes the one holding everything together, and the world usually realizes it one mistake too late. Morning sunlight poured through the towering glass walls of Sterling Dynamics, casting long reflections across polished marble floors as employees hurried through the headquarters in downtown Seattle. Conversations echoed between modern workstations, elevator doors opened and closed without pause, and digital displays streamed performance numbers that seemed to promise another successful quarter. No one expected the atmosphere to change within the next few minutes. Ethan Walker adjusted the strap of his worn leather laptop bag as he stepped into the executive conference room. At 39 years old, he carried himself with quiet confidence rather than ambition. His blue button-down shirt was neatly pressed, his appearance simple beside the expensive suit surrounding him. Yet there was a calm steadiness in his eyes that years of difficult choices had quietly shaped. He had spent countless late nights solving problems that very few people ever knew existed, and he had never asked for recognition. Across the room, Victoria Sterling stood at the head of the conference table. At 38, the Billionaire chief executive officer had built a reputation for making bold decisions without hesitation. Her tailored navy business suit, composed posture, and measured voice reflected a leader accustomed to carrying enormous responsibility. Around her sat vice presidents, department heads, and senior managers waiting for another decisive announcement. Victoria looked directly at Ethan before breaking the silence. Sterling Dynamics is entering a new phase, she said evenly. We need leaders who can move faster than ever before. Several executives exchanged brief glances. Ethan remained still. After careful consideration, Victoria continued, I have decided to eliminate your position effective immediately. The words settled over the room with surprising weight. No one spoke. Daniel Brooks, the company's chief technology officer, shifted slightly in his chair, clearly uncomfortable, but he remained silent as the decision unfolded. Ethan simply nodded once. Understood, he replied calmly. There was no argument, no anger, no attempt to defend himself. He gathered his notebook, closed his laptop carefully, and thanked everyone for the opportunities he had received. That quiet response somehow made the room feel even heavier. As Ethan walked through the open office one final time, conversations gradually faded. Some employees looked down at their desks. Others watched him leave with expressions that mixed confusion and regret. They all knew him as the engineer who answered questions without making anyone feel small, the colleague who stayed late whenever someone else needed help, and the father who always left the building at exactly 5:30 every evening without exception. Outside the headquarters, 11-year-old Noah Walker sat patiently on a nearby bench reading a library book while waiting for his father, just as he did after school whenever schedules overlapped. The moment he saw Ethan step through the revolving doors carrying a cardboard box with a family photograph, a coffee mug, and a small potted plant, Noah quietly stood. Are we going home early today? He asked with a gentle smile. Ethan looked at his son for a brief moment before returning the smile. Yes, he answered warmly. Looks like we have a little extra time together. Noah accepted the answer without another question. The two climbed into Ethan's aging pickup truck and slowly disappeared into Seattle traffic beneath a clear blue sky. Back inside Sterling Dynamics, employees returned to work while executives moved toward their next meetings, believing the morning's difficult decision was already behind them. Then, almost unnoticed, a tiny yellow notification appeared in the corner of one monitoring screen inside the Network Operations Center. It was small enough that nobody stopped to investigate. One engineer glanced at it for less than a second before turning back to another task. The alert quietly remained on the screen, blinking once, then again, waiting patiently for someone to realize that the most expensive mistake of the day had not been firing an employee. It had been overlooking the only person who truly understood what that little warning meant. The old pickup truck rolled quietly through familiar Seattle streets as the afternoon sun settled lower across the neighborhood, painting warm shades of gold over sidewalks lined with maple trees. Ethan Walker drove, with one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, while Noah sat beside him reading another chapter from his library book. Neither of them mentioned the cardboard box resting on the back seat, because neither believed a difficult day deserved more attention than the people sharing it. "Do you still want homemade spaghetti tonight?" Noah asked without looking away from a page. Ethan smiled softly. "I believe that sounds even better than it did this morning." Noah closed the book with a satisfied grin. "Then I will make the salad." Ethan laughed quietly. That sounds like a fair partnership. Their small house welcomed them with a familiar comfort that expensive offices could never replace. The kitchen smelled faintly of fresh herbs growing beside the window. Family photographs lined the hallway, and the refrigerator door displayed school artwork collected over several years. Ethan carefully placed the cardboard box on a shelf in the hallway before washing his hands and beginning dinner exactly as he had done hundreds of evenings before. Nothing in the house suggested disappointment. Everything suggested stability. Noah chopped lettuce with careful attention, while Ethan stirred tomato sauce, simmering slowly on the stove. Classical music played softly from an old radio, mixing with the gentle sounds of cooking that had become part of their daily routine. "Are you worried?" Noah finally asked. Ethan considered the question before answering. "I'm responsible for finding another job," he replied honestly. "But I'm not worried about who we are. A job can change. Character should not." Noah nodded thoughtfully as though storing those words somewhere important. Across the city, the atmosphere inside Sterling Dynamics felt very different. Engineers noticed that several internal services were responding slightly slower than usual. The delays measured only fractions of a second, small enough that most users never noticed, yet large enough to appear on technical monitoring dashboards. One engineer refreshed the display twice before assuming the numbers would return to normal on their own. Another quietly opened a support ticket marked low priority. Daniel Brooks glanced across multiple system reports while finishing another meeting. Nothing appeared serious enough to interrupt the day's schedule. "Keep watching it," he told the operations team calmly. "It is probably temporary." Victoria Sterling spent the remainder of the afternoon reviewing acquisition proposals and meeting with investors. The earlier decision to eliminate Ethan's position already felt like another completed executive task. Growth demanded efficiency, and efficiency often required difficult choices. At least that was the principle she had followed for years. Yet for reasons she could not explain, Ethan's calm acceptance lingered in the back of her thoughts far longer than she expected. Most people argued. Some became angry. Others tried desperately to negotiate. Ethan had simply thanked everyone and walked away. The memory quietly unsettled her. As evening settled over Seattle, the small yellow notification inside the Network Operations Center disappeared from one screen only to reappear moments later on another. System latency increased almost imperceptibly. Authentication requests accumulated a little more slowly than before. Automatic safeguards compensated for the growing imbalance, hiding the problem from ordinary users while placing additional strain on neighboring services. Everything still appeared stable. Everything still looked healthy. The warning signs remained too small for anyone to consider urgent. Back at home, Ethan and Noah finished dinner together before washing dishes side by side. They laughed over a story from school, organized homework across the dining table, and ended the evening exactly as they always had. Outside, neighborhood porch lights gradually illuminated the quiet street, while stars appeared one by one above the city. Far away, deep inside Sterling Dynamics, another unnoticed delay quietly joined the first. Then another followed. The company believed it had solved its staffing decisions that morning. What nobody realized was that a much larger problem had already begun growing beneath the surface, hidden behind numbers that still looked almost perfectly normal. The next morning began with an uneasy silence inside Sterling Dynamics that nobody could quite explain. Employees arrived carrying coffee cups and laptop bags, just as they had every other weekday. Yet the building no longer possessed the effortless rhythm that usually defined it. Elevator doors opened to anxious conversations. Computer screens filled with monitoring dashboards, and support requests began arriving more frequently than anyone considered normal. At first, the delays seemed insignificant. A client waited an extra second to sign into an account. Another transaction paused before completing successfully. Customer service representatives reassured callers that everything appeared operational, while engineers quietly assured one another the temporary slowdown would disappear on its own. Instead, the numbers continued climbing. Daniel Brooks stood inside the network operations center watching graphs stretch steadily upward. Response times increased across multiple services, but every individual system still appeared technically healthy. The contradiction frustrated everyone in the room. The servers are running normally, one senior engineer reported. Processor usage is stable. Memory looks healthy. Network traffic is within expected limits. Another engineer frowned while studying a different dashboard. Then why are authentication requests taking longer every hour? Nobody had an answer. Daniel folded his arms thoughtfully. Expand the monitoring scope, he instructed calmly. We are measuring something incorrectly. Find the bottleneck before customers begin noticing. Across the executive floor, Victoria Sterling listened as department leaders summarized the growing technical concerns. The reports sounded contradictory. Performance indicators remained green while customer complaints gradually increased. She looked toward Daniel. How serious is this? Daniel answered honestly. Not serious yet, but I do not understand what I am seeing in that. Concerns me more than the numbers themselves. Victoria nodded slowly. Keep me informed every 30 minutes. Several miles away, Ethan Walker sat at the dining table updating his resume while Noah completed math homework beside him. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and the quiet house felt far removed from the growing tension downtown. After finishing another page of equations, Noah absent-mindedly began arranging colored pencils into neat rows. "Dad," he said without looking up, "have you ever seen traffic stop even when every road is open?" Ethan looked over with curiosity. "What do you mean?" Noah placed one red pencil across several blue pencils. "Imagine every street in a city is clear except one traffic light. If that one light stays red too long, every car behind it starts waiting. The roads are not broken. Everybody is just waiting for permission to keep moving." Ethan smiled gently at the simple explanation. "That is actually a very smart observation." Noah shrugged. "It is just common sense." Ethan's smile slowly faded as the words echoed in his thoughts. Waiting for permission. Authentication. A single control point. His eyes drifted toward the notebook lying open beside his resume. Suddenly, dozens of memories returned at once. Architectural diagrams. Queue management. Legacy authorization routing. Years earlier, he had designed a centralized authentication service that quietly coordinated access across the company's growing platform. It had worked flawlessly because it almost never drew attention, unless something inside it began waiting too long. Ethan stared silently at the table. Noah noticed the change immediately. "Did I say something strange?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "No," he answered. "You may have reminded me of something everyone else has forgotten." At nearly the same moment inside Sterling Dynamics, another wave of delayed authentication requests spread across additional services. Engineers continued replacing healthy components, restarting stable applications, and examining systems that were never truly failing. Every attempted solution consumed valuable time, while the invisible queue continued growing beneath the surface. Daniel watched another chart update before quietly speaking to himself. "We keep looking at the traffic after the intersection," he whispered. "What if the problem is the traffic light?" The room fell silent as several engineers turned toward him. Somewhere between an 11-year-old boy arranging colored pencils at a kitchen table and a chief technology officer staring at a wall of glowing monitors, the first real clue had finally begun to emerge. Daniel Brooks did not waste another minute. He stepped away from a wall of monitoring screens, pulled his phone from his pocket, and stared silently at Ethan Walker's contact information. The decision should have been simple, yet it felt strangely difficult after everything that had happened only one day earlier. Around him, engineers continued comparing charts, restarting services, and searching through millions of lines of system logs. Every dashboard still displayed healthy infrastructure, But customer delays continued increasing with quiet persistence. Daniel finally pressed the call button. Across town, Ethan had just finished sketching a rough diagram on a yellow legal pad, while Noah watched with genuine curiosity. Boxes, arrows, and handwritten notes gradually recreated the architecture Ethan had designed years before. His phone vibrated on the kitchen table. He glanced at the screen before answering. "Hello, Daniel." The voice on the other end carried unusual hesitation. "Ethan, I know this is not an easy call." Ethan remained calm. "Tell me what is happening." Daniel described the strange behavior in careful detail. Authentication requests slowed without obvious failures. System resources appeared normal. Every attempted solution improved nothing. Ethan listened quietly without interrupting. When Daniel finished, several seconds passed before Ethan spoke again. "Have you checked the legacy authorization queue?" Daniel looked toward the engineers surrounding him. "We have monitored the authentication service." Ethan answered gently. "Monitoring is not the same as understanding. Look behind the current queue. There should be an older routing layer that almost nobody remembers." Daniel's expression changed. Immediately, that component was retired years ago. "No," Ethan replied softly. "It was hidden, not retired. I left it there because removing it during expansion would have created unnecessary risk." Daniel turned toward the nearest engineer. "Search for every legacy authorization dependency immediately." Fingers raced across keyboards as forgotten documentation slowly surfaced from archived repositories. Ethan listened to the distant sounds of hurried conversations through the phone before speaking once more. "I can explain everything faster in person." Daniel took a slow breath. "Would you be willing to come back?" Ethan looked toward Noah, who quietly closed his math notebook without saying a word. The boy already understood what his father was thinking. Ethan smiled gently. "I'm not coming back because I was right," he answered. "I am coming because people are counting on the system to work." Less than 30 minutes later, the familiar pickup truck entered the underground parking garage beneath Sterling Dynamics. Noah sat beside his father carrying a small backpack filled with homework and library books. "Will I stay out of everyone's way?" he asked. Ethan nodded warmly. "That is all I need you to do." They entered the headquarters together. Employees who had watched Ethan leave with a cardboard box the previous afternoon now watched him return carrying nothing except a notebook and quiet confidence. Conversations softened as he walked through the lobby. Some offered respectful smiles. Others simply stepped aside without speaking. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. The atmosphere had changed completely. Daniel met them near the elevator with visible relief. "Thank you for coming," he said sincerely. Ethan offered a small nod. "Show me the live data." Victoria Sterling stood inside the operations center as Ethan entered. Their eyes met briefly. Neither mentioned the previous morning. There would be time for difficult conversations later. Right now, the company faced a challenge much larger than personal pride. Ethan placed his notebook on the nearest workstation and studied the flowing charts without touching a keyboard. Noah quietly settled into an empty chair near the back of the room, opening his homework while occasionally glancing toward the glowing screens that covered the walls. Engineers continued discussing possible causes, each explanation growing more complicated than the last. Ethan remained silent, carefully observing every graph, every timestamp, and every pattern. Sometimes experience spoke loudest when it said nothing at all, and before a single command had been entered, he already suspected that the real problem was hiding exactly where almost everyone had stopped looking years before. The operations center grew quieter with every passing minute as Ethan Walker studied the live system without touching the keyboard. Engineers continued proposing increasingly complex explanations, yet Ethan focused only on the rhythm of the data flowing across dozens of monitors. His eyes moved from one chart to another before stopping at a timeline that almost everyone else had ignored. "Show me the archived authorization queue," he said calmly. One engineer hesitated. "That process is only a compatibility layer. It has not been important for years." Ethan looked at him with quiet patience. "Please open it anyway." Within seconds, an old diagnostic window appeared on the largest display. At first glance, everything seemed normal. But Ethan noticed tiny timing differences hidden inside thousands of successful requests. "Zoom in," he said. The graph expanded until individual processing intervals became visible. Daniel Brooks leaned closer. "Those delays are increasing." Ethan nodded. "Not because the servers are overloaded. They are waiting for permission from a queue that should never become this long." Victoria Sterling watched silently as the room shifted from uncertainty to cautious hope. Ethan reached for the keyboard and typed only a few commands. He did not restart services. He did not replace hardware. Instead, he opened a configuration file that almost nobody in the company remembered existed. "This routing table was designed years ago," he explained quietly. "It protected the platform while the company expanded. Every new service eventually depended on it, but because it always worked, everyone forgot it. It was still here." An engineer looked surprised. "Who designed this architecture?" Ethan answered without looking away from the screen. "I did." The room became still. Before anyone could respond, Noah looked up from the chair where he had been finishing his homework. His attention rested on a small indicator blinking beside one of the archive processes. "Dad," he said politely, "that little light keeps changing before the line gets longer." Several engineers turned toward him. Ethan followed his son's gaze and smiled faintly. "Good catch." He enlarged the diagnostic window and immediately noticed a repeating synchronization cycle hidden behind the growing queue. "That is it," he whispered. "The compatibility timer is retrying far too often." Daniel frowned. "None of our monitoring tools highlighted that." Ethan replied, "Because everyone was measuring the traffic after the intersection instead of the traffic light itself." A few gentle keystrokes adjusted the forgotten timing parameter to the value Ethan had originally documented years earlier. He paused for a moment before pressing the final confirmation key. Nobody spoke. Every eye in the room shifted toward the monitoring wall. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. Authentication requests began clearing in steady waves. Response times dropped. Customer sessions recovered one by one. The growing backlog quietly disappeared until every performance graph returned to its normal pattern. A long silence filled the room before one engineer finally whispered, "Everything is stabilizing." Another refreshed the dashboard twice, almost unable to believe what he was seeing. "The delays are gone." Daniel released a slow breath he had been holding for hours. Victoria continued watching the screens without saying a word. The crisis that had threatened the company had been resolved without dramatic speeches or grand gestures. Ethan simply closed the diagnostic window and stepped away from the keyboard. "Continue monitoring for another hour," he said calmly. "The system should balance itself now." As engineers hurried to verify the recovery, one member of the infrastructure team quietly searched the historical archives connected to the forgotten authorization layer. An old design document appeared on his screen bearing a single name beneath the original architecture approval. He stared at it for several seconds before looking toward Ethan with growing disbelief. The man who had quietly solved the company's greatest technical crisis had not merely understood the system better than everyone else. He had been the person who built the invisible foundation that had protected Sterling Dynamics for years, while almost everyone had forgotten his contribution. The recovery continued throughout the afternoon as every major performance chart returned to normal. Customer support calls gradually declined. Automated alerts disappeared one after another, and the atmosphere inside Sterling Dynamics shifted from quiet panic to cautious relief. Engineers who had spent hours chasing invisible failures now gathered around historical system records, trying to understand how a forgotten compatibility layer had quietly supported the company's entire technology platform for so many years. One infrastructure specialist opened another archive document and frowned. There are hundreds of references pointing back to the same original design. Daniel Brooks stepped closer. "Who approved the architecture?" The engineer slowly turned his monitor so everyone nearby could see the faded digital signature at the bottom of the file. "Ethan Walker." Another engineer searched a different repository, then another. Every result revealed the same pattern: the authentication framework, the distributed routing model, the emergency recovery procedures. The Scalability Roadmap. Each foundational document carried Ethan's name. "This cannot be right," one manager whispered. "These designs built almost everything we still use." Daniel nodded quietly. "It is right." He looked toward Ethan, who was calmly organizing his notebook while Noah packed away his homework. Most of these systems were created before many of us even joined the company. Victoria Sterling remained silent as additional files continued appearing on the large conference display. Meeting transcripts from years earlier showed Ethan recommending long-term solutions instead of short-term shortcuts. Performance reports demonstrated that every major expansion had relied on architectural decisions he had made long before the company reached its current size. Promotion records appeared next. Victoria studied them carefully. Ethan had been nominated for executive leadership 3 different times. Each promotion request had been declined by Ethan himself. She looked at Daniel with visible confusion. Why would someone refuse opportunities like these? Daniel answered softly. Because every offer arrived during the same difficult period. He opened one final personnel record that had remained sealed except for executive review. The room became completely quiet. Several years earlier, shortly after Ethan's wife had passed away following a serious illness, he had requested a modified schedule instead of a larger office, a higher salary, or greater authority. His only priority had been leaving work in time to pick up his young son every afternoon. Rather than accepting executive responsibilities that demanded constant travel and endless evening meetings, he had chosen to remain a senior architect, so Noah would never come home to an empty house. Daniel spoke with quiet respect. He sacrificed promotions to become the father his son needed. Nobody responded immediately. Across the room, Noah looked up after hearing his name mentioned, but returned to placing books inside his backpack without drawing attention to himself. Ethan noticed several people watching him and simply smiled politely, as though the conversation belonged to someone else. Victoria slowly lowered the personnel file. The man she had dismissed as no longer essential had quietly given years of extraordinary work without asking for recognition, while making personal choices that reflected commitment rather than weakness. She remembered his calm expression when she had ended his employment, the absence of anger in his voice, and the dignity with which he had walked away, carrying only a small cardboard box. The memory now felt heavier than before. Ethan closed his notebook and thanked Daniel for allowing him to help before preparing to leave with Noah. He expected nothing more than returning home for dinner together. As he reached the doorway, an older employee who had worked beside him since the company's early years quietly stood and began applauding. The sound echoed gently through the operations center. One by one, other employees rose from their chairs until the room filled with sincere applause, not celebrating the solution alone, but honoring the quiet man whose greatest achievements had always been hidden beneath humility, responsibility, and the simple promise he had kept every evening to the little boy waiting faithfully beside him. The applause gradually faded, but the feeling it left behind remained in every corner of the operations center. Nobody hurried back to a keyboard. Nobody checked a phone. For the first time in years, deadlines, quarterly reports, and financial projections seemed less important than the quiet lesson unfolding before them. Ethan Walker stood beside Noah with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the entire day. He neither celebrated nor accepted the attention as though it belonged to him alone. He simply waited for the room to settle. Victoria Sterling slowly stepped forward. Her confident executive posture remained unchanged, yet there was a humility in her eyes that had not been there the previous morning. She looked first at Noah, then at Ethan, before addressing everyone gathered around them. "Yesterday," she began, "I believed I was making a decision based on efficiency. Today, I understand that I made a decision without fully understanding the person standing in front of me." The room became completely silent. Victoria turned toward Ethan. "I judge your value by what I could immediately measure. I never stopped to learn the story behind your choices. I never asked why someone with your experience remained in the same position while refusing promotions that others would have accepted without hesitation. That failure belongs entirely to me." Ethan listened quietly without interrupting. Victoria continued with steady honesty. You built systems that carried this company through years of growth. You protected those systems with wisdom that continued serving us long after many of us forgot where that foundation came from. Even more important, you demonstrated that leadership is not measured by titles or office size. It is measured by character. Several employees lowered their eyes, remembering how quickly they had accepted the decision to dismiss him. Victoria took another slow breath. I owe you a public apology, Ethan. I am truly sorry for dismissing your contributions, for overlooking your integrity, and for failing to recognize the sacrifices you quietly made for your family while continuing to strengthen this company. The silence that followed felt deeper than any applause. Ethan finally smiled with the same gentle warmth that had always defined him. Thank you, he replied softly. Accepting responsibility requires courage. I appreciate your honesty. Victoria looked relieved, but Ethan was not finished. He turned slightly so everyone in the room could hear him. There is something I have learned during my career, he said. The easiest way to misunderstand someone is to judge only the chapter you happen to witness. Every person carries responsibilities that cannot be seen from an office doorway or a meeting schedule. Sometimes the strongest employee leaves exactly on time because someone at home is waiting. Sometimes the quietest voice belongs to the person carrying the greatest experience. Respect should always come before assumptions. His words settled gently across the room without accusation or resentment. Daniel Brooks nodded in quiet agreement, while several younger engineers exchanged thoughtful glances. Noah looked proudly at his father, not because he had solved a technical problem, but because he had chosen kindness when he had every reason to be bitter. Victoria understood that difference as well. She realized the company had narrowly avoided losing something far more valuable than technical expertise. It had almost lost an example of the culture every organization hoped to build but rarely achieved. As employees slowly returned to their workstations, conversations sounded different. They spoke more carefully, listened more closely, and thanked one another more often. Ethan gathered his notebook and gently placed a hand on Noah's shoulder. Together they walked toward the elevator, leaving behind a room filled not only with restored technology, but with a renewed understanding that true greatness often arrives quietly, asks for very little, and earns lasting respect without ever demanding it. The following morning, the atmosphere inside Sterling Dynamics felt unmistakably different. Employees greeted one another with genuine smiles. Conversations carried a little more patience, and the hurried rhythm that usually filled the building had softened into something more thoughtful. The technical crisis had ended, but its greatest impact reached far beyond computer systems. It had quietly changed the way people looked at one another. Shortly after 9 o'clock, Daniel Brooks knocked gently on the conference room door where Ethan Walker and Noah were waiting. Victoria would like to speak with both of you, he said warmly. Ethan nodded and followed him upstairs while Noah carried his backpack beside him with quiet curiosity. Inside the executive conference room, Victoria Sterling stood near the windows overlooking the Seattle skyline. The morning sunlight reflected across the glass towers outside, reminding her how quickly success could create the illusion that every important answer was already visible from the top floor. She welcomed Ethan with sincere respect rather than executive formality. Thank you for meeting with me again, she said. Ethan smiled politely. Of course. Victoria placed a folder on the conference table before speaking. Yesterday, I apologized for a mistake. Today, I would like to correct it. She slowly opened the folder. I would like to invite you to return as our chief systems architect with complete authority over long-term platform design and engineering standards. The position includes executive compensation, leadership responsibilities, and every resource you need to build the future of this company. The room remained quiet for several moments. Ethan looked at the offer without reaching for it. Finally, he raised his eyes. I am honored by your confidence, he said gently. Before I answer, there are two conditions that matter more to me than the title. Victoria nodded immediately. Please tell me. Ethan folded his hands calmly. First, I would like every engineer, regardless of experience or position, to have a real opportunity to share ideas before important technical decisions are finalized. Innovation often begins with the person nobody expects to have the answer. Daniel smiled slightly, remembering the colored pencils spread across Ethan's kitchen table. Ethan continued, "Second, I will continue leaving this building at 5:30 every evening unless there is an extraordinary emergency. My son deserves a father who keeps his promises, and I do not believe professional excellence should require sacrificing the people waiting at home." Noah looked quietly at his father without speaking. Victoria did not hesitate. "Both conditions are accepted," she answered. "In fact, I believe they will make this company stronger." She paused before adding one more thought. Leadership should help people succeed at work without asking them to fail where life matters most. Ethan extended his hand, and Victoria accepted it with genuine appreciation. The agreement felt less like a contract and more like the beginning of a different culture. Over the following weeks, subtle changes appeared throughout Sterling Dynamics. Technical review meetings welcomed questions from junior engineers before senior managers spoke. Mentoring sessions replaced unnecessary competition. Managers began evaluating results alongside character, collaboration, and long-term thinking. Employees noticed that executives listened longer before making decisions, and those decisions became wiser because more voices were heard. Every afternoon at exactly 5:30, Ethan packed his notebook, wished his colleagues a pleasant evening, and walked through the lobby where people now smiled with quiet respect instead of surprise. Noah often waited on the same bench outside the building with another library book in his hands. Together they climbed into the familiar pickup truck and drove home through the evening traffic while the city lights slowly awakened around them. Inside the headquarters, many employees watched from the windows as the old truck disappeared down the street, and more than one person quietly realized that the strongest leader in the company was not the one who stayed the latest, but the one who understood exactly when it was time to go home. Several weeks passed, and the story of that extraordinary day slowly became part of Sterling Dynamics. Not because employees enjoyed repeating it, but because they quietly lived its lessons every day. The company continued growing, new clients arrived, and ambitious projects moved forward with greater confidence than ever before. Yet visitors who walked through the headquarters noticed something that could never appear on financial reports. Engineers listened before speaking. Managers asked questions before reaching conclusions. Young employees no longer feared offering ideas because they knew their voices would be heard with respect. The greatest transformation had not happened inside the company's technology. It had happened inside its culture. Ethan Walker never tried to become the center of attention. Each morning he greeted coworkers with the same quiet kindness that had always defined him. He mentored new engineers without reminding anyone of his accomplishments, patiently explaining difficult concepts until others understood them for themselves. When problems appeared, he focused on solutions instead of blame. His leadership quietly spread through example rather than instruction, and people trusted him because his actions always matched his words. Noah continued visiting the headquarters after school from time to time, sitting peacefully in the lobby with library books while waiting for his father. Many employees stopped to greet him, remembering that a simple observation from an 11-year-old had helped everyone see a problem from a different perspective. Noah accepted every compliment with the same humility he had learned at home. He never claimed to have saved the company. He simply smiled and said that his father had taught him to pay attention to small things because small things often mattered more than people realized. Victoria Sterling changed as well. She still made difficult executive decisions, but she no longer believed that numbers alone revealed the complete truth about the people behind them. Before major meetings, she often walked through the engineering floor, speaking with employees whose names she had never known before. She discovered talented people carrying quiet responsibilities outside the office, parents balancing family and work, caregivers supporting aging relatives, and young professionals overcoming challenges nobody else could see. Those conversations reminded her that every successful organization was ultimately built by human stories rather than spreadsheets. One cool autumn evening, Ethan finished work precisely at 5:30, closed his notebook, and wished everyone a pleasant night. Noah waited outside, beside the familiar pickup truck, holding 2 grocery bags they had picked up on the way. Together they drove home beneath a sky painted with soft shades of orange and blue. Their small house welcomed them with its usual warmth. Fresh bread baked in the oven, tomato soup simmered gently on the stove, and laughter filled the kitchen as they prepared dinner side by side. Nothing about the evening appeared extraordinary, yet everything about it reflected a promise faithfully kept. At nearly the same moment, Victoria stood alone beside the wide windows of her office overlooking the Seattle skyline. Far below, she watched the old pickup truck disappear into the steady flow of evening traffic. She could have measured quarterly profits, reviewed expansion plans, or celebrated another successful business milestone. Instead, she quietly smiled as she realized that the greatest success she had witnessed was not the recovery of a company, but the character of a father who had never allowed professional achievement to replace the people waiting for him at home. In the end, the crisis had restored far more than a technology platform. It had restored perspective. It reminded everyone that dignity never needs to announce itself. Wisdom often speaks with a gentle voice, and true leadership is revealed not by the power to command a room, but by the humility to honor every person within it. Some victories fill headlines for a single day, but the quiet victories built on integrity, grace, respect, and second chances continue shaping lives long after the applause has faded into silence.